With the collapse of the USSR, capitalists everywhere say communism is dead. And when China inaugurates its first stock exchange, they claim final victory in the struggle between capitalism and communism, which has been the life and death issue of the 20th century. International investors, capitalists, local and foreign, rush to make profits in what they call the world's fastest-growing economy. They point to the events in China as proof that the free market economy is the best way to develop and organize society. And while it may be so for the very few, for many like these peasants, 100 million of whom are now homeless, the change has brought only misery. The reality of conditions in China, a situation which is repeated throughout the world, shows us a system which doesn't work for the majority of the world's population. We, in the Progressive Labor Party, believe the alternative is still communism. Not the so-called communism of the USSR and China, but a true egalitarian society. In this video, we will explain our ideas, focusing on the party's growth in Latin America. The PLP was founded 30 years ago in New York at a time of intense conflict in the communist world. The Chinese Communist Party was criticizing the USSR for abandoning class struggle.
Of course, this had a big influence on us because we saw the same sort of opportunism or revisionism in the Communist Party USA. So a few of us in Buffalo, and those of us who were then in New York, a handful of us, decided at the time was to set up a revolutionary party that was based on the Marxist-Leninist concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, or workers' dictatorship over the bosses. Democracy for the workers and nothing for the bosses.
La burguesía será aplastada y por eso debemos luchar contra el desempleo, contra el racismo, por la dictadura del proletariado, bajo la vanguardia roja, la bandera roja del Partido Laboral Progresista, el partido de las masas, el partido de los obreros. ¡Viva el marxismo-leninismo! ¡Viva el Partido Laboral Progresista!
By 1970, the party was growing dramatically, attracting workers and students with its ideas of multiracial unity, the fight against sexism and racism, and the revolutionary struggle for workers' power. The party's international outlook soon led to ties with workers in Canada, Europe, and Mexico.
We've been in Mexico for over a decade. Party members in Oaxaca, Mexico City, and Hermosillo have been introducing the party's ideas to workers from all walks of life. In the late 80s, the party started organizing in South and Central America, and we've had people joining the party since then.
To talk to some of these new members, we traveled to Colombia, El Salvador, and Ecuador. In Quito, we spoke to Victor, a health worker who doesn't want to appear on camera.
We don't want to show our faces on video talking openly about communism. It's too risky. If the tape fell into the hands of the enemy, we'd all be targeted and the party's work would be jeopardized.
My son has disappeared. So far, we don't know anything. The government doesn't care about them.
In Colombia, where party members must work clandestinely, a violent class war has been going on for 50 years, hidden behind the much-talked-of drug war. 150,000 people, union members, organizers, and guerrilla fighters have been killed in the last 5 years alone. In El Salvador, assassinations continue in spite of the peace agreement signed in 1991 between the government and the FMLN guerrillas to end the 12-year war, a war in which 80,000 people died. Because of these repressive conditions, actors are presenting the ideas of the people we interviewed. We start in Colombia with Miguel, a factory worker, and ask the question, why did you join the Progressive Labor Party?
Fascism is growing every day. The bosses are working us longer hours, cutting our wages, throwing us out of work. Our right to strike has been restricted. Strikers have been jailed on charges of terrorism. Hunger and misery are everywhere. We were looking for a way out of this mess.
PRP's idea of one world, one working class, one party fighting for workers' power attracted us. We saw that it was the only way to end exploitation.
We were disillusioned with the revolutionary groups we were in. They were making more and more compromises with the bourgeoisie.
Here in Morazan, FMLN-controlled territory and site of their official radio station, Venceremos, a spokesperson talks about the guerrillas' shift to the right following the peace agreements.
Our position is in the center, and so we are impartial.
But in class struggle, there's no neutral ground.
For 3 decades, we have been fighting revolutionary wars to get rid of poverty and oppression. Some of the leaders of these movements, like the FMLN, have declared victory, but nothing has changed for the majority of the people in Latin America.
There is no help for the poor.
We don't have jobs.
There are some who don't have food. On Sunday, we had nothing to eat.
In Colombia and Ecuador, the living conditions for workers are no better than in El Salvador. Millions have fled the countryside and the brutality of the army and settled here, and they're still coming. New arrivals like this woman are forced higher up the mountainside. They live in makeshift homes, traveling hours every day to the city where they try to find work. But with 64 out of 100 workers without a permanent job, many can only pick up casual work. Others try to make a living selling on the streets. Many people living high up in Quito have no public services. Every day this woman walks a mile to her daughter's house for water.
Communist parties in Ecuador are not interested in bettering the conditions for the working class. They're not interested in developing the ideas of Marxist-Leninism. All they're interested in is getting votes.
We wanted to fight for the proletariat, but we did not know how, until we came across the literature of the Progressive Labor Party. Then it became clear why our revolutions had failed. No one fought for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Armed struggle is not enough. Workers must seize state power. But what convinced us to build the party here was Road to Revolution 4.
In 1982, Road to Revolution 4 reevaluated the Soviet and Chinese revolutions. It pointed out the contradictions of revolutionaries who talked about an egalitarian society, but who never got rid of privileged classes and wages. Both Lenin and Mao thought that a communist society could be built in stages. In the first stage after the revolution, they kept wages and classes. This is the fundamental structure of capitalist society. This stage, which they call socialism, they believe would lead to communism. But history, as pointed out in Road to Revolution 4, showed this to be a mistake. Look at the USSR and China. Socialism, or what some people call state capitalism, has produced a new ruling class, and this has reverted to full-blown capitalism. Workers who have fought to liberate themselves in the past are finding themselves just as exploited as they ever were.
El camino a la Revolución 4 nos enseñó
Road to Revolution 4 showed us that to end exploitation of workers, we had to fight for an egalitarian society immediately after taking power. No socialist stage, no classes, no buying or selling of labor power, or anything else, no wages or money.
Los comunistas suprimirán el dinero.
Communists will do away with money. We will produce only what people need and share what we have. We joined the Progressive Labor Party to fight for communism, real communism.
Through its newspaper Challenge, which is published in 5 languages on 3 continents, the party builds class consciousness among workers, pointing out their historical mission to take power away from the ruling class. It outlines the party's revolutionary strategy of winning millions of workers and their allies to see the vital need of armed insurrection leading to communist revolution. To build the movement, the party emphasizes the fight against racism, sexism, and nationalism, which capitalists use to keep us apart.
We joined the party because of its anti-racist line. When we were refugees in California in the 1980s, PLP was fighting the racist U.S. Immigration Service, the Ku Klux Klan, and leading the struggle for better working conditions in the garment factories and grape fields where we worked.
Con el partido entendimos que el racismo no es parte de la naturaleza humana.
Through the party, we understood racism wasn't human nature, but a cornerstone of capitalism. To maximize their profits, the bosses exploit some races more than others. This makes a cheap labor pool and all workers' wages are lowered. To prop up this super exploitation, capitalists spread phony theories of racial inferiority.
De esa manera, se separan a los blancos de los negros,
which divide whites from blacks,
de los blancos,
Latins from whites, and stop us from uniting in the struggle, whether it's a strike or communist revolution.
En la lucha por la revolución comunista.
Racist exploitation played an essential role in the development of capitalism itself as the Spanish conquistadors, beginning in the 15th century, looted the gold and silver of the Americas to finance the early industrialization of Europe. Millions of the continent's indigenous population and African slaves died through forced labor in the mines. To justify their brutality, the colonialists entered into partnership with the Catholic Church, which has endured until today. In the 15th century, the union of church and state was fresh from the Inquisition, where the killing of Jews and Arabs had been committed with God's authority, the same racist ideology which condoned the slaughter in the new territories. Popes blessed the ships that sailed across the ocean, and then as now, religion served the interests of the ruling class, enslaving the minds of millions of Latin Americans. Today, the indigenous population is a fraction of its original size, decimated by centuries of repression. Colonial rule was shaken off in the 19th century, but not its racism. Genocide continued, and indigenous and black workers remain the most exploited of Latin America's working class. The continent's post-colonial history is full of examples of its racist legacy. One that stands out happened in 1932 in El Salvador, when in a few days of savage attacks, the country's ruling class exterminated all of the indigenous population. It was a time when the old communist movement was strong and inspiring workers around the world. In El Salvador, years of strikes and rebellions finally resulted in an insurrection of urban workers and peasants led by communists. It was what the ruling class feared most, workers of different races united by communism. The Salvadorian rulers, with U.S. battleships behind them, brutally crushed the insurgency. Out of a population of 1 million, 30,000 people were killed. Indigenous workers, rebels or not, were targeted. Those who were not killed abandoned their distinctive clothing, customs, and language to escape death. Today, El Salvador has little trace of its indigenous roots, but still, campesinos are considered to be Indian, and agricultural workers are paid considerably less than their urban counterparts.
In their analysis of capitalism, traditional Latin American communist parties never show racism to be fundamental. In the 70 years they have been leading the working class, they failed to attack racism.
Nunca han atacado al racismo.
These revolutionaries have not overcome their own racism. The fight against racism is what drew me to PLP.
The capitalist class makes huge profits from sexism, using it to sell their products and paying women less than men for equal work.
Here, organizations of the so-called left divide workers by creating groups of women who fight only to better their own conditions. So women, already marginalized by society, isolate themselves even more. PRP unites women and men in one single class to fight against the system which exploits both men and women.
We have to fight sexism and machismo, which is ingrained by this culture into men's and even women's heads.
Nationalism, the idea that workers of one nation have more in common with their bosses than with workers of other nations, can push us to fight wars which benefit only the capitalists.
That happened in Central America in 1969, when Salvadoran workers fought Honduran workers. The ruling class's patriotic propaganda fooled them into thinking they were fighting for their country, but in reality they were fighting for the profit of the bosses.
Nationalism is not only embraced by capitalists, but also by so-called communists. Road to Revolution 3, published in 1971, shows that whenever nationalism is used as a tactic in revolutionary struggle, workers always lose out. Since 1971, one guerrilla movement after another has made alliances with local capitalists.
They justify their alliances with the bosses by saying they're being realistic given the situation. But what really matters is the reality of the situation from the point of view of the workers. In Nicaragua and El Salvador, workers' conditions are worse than when they started to fight.
Guerrilla movements fight for national liberation and against imperialism, but do absolutely nothing to change the class system.
En Perú, Sendero Luminoso, si llega al poder.
In Peru, Sendero Luminoso, if they take power, will set up what they call a Republic of New Democracy, which is a new name for the same old bourgeois economy. The only difference is that Sendero will be in control.
In Cuba, radical reforms improve conditions, but only temporarily.
Here in Colombia, some of the guerrilla groups have reached an agreement with the government. Others are still fighting, but only as a tactic to get a better deal when they negotiate.
These alliances led to compromises where the working class never took power.
We started studying the party's literature in 1988. After we decided to join the party, we grew rapidly. Today we have party members in unions, among factory workers, teachers, and students. Recently we made an important step forward to work in black organizations. Black workers make up 14% of the Colombian labor force. They live on the coasts and in southern country towns where there's little work, forcing them to move to the cities. They are very receptive to our ideas. We now have a base among workers and students living in the barrios, which have spread up the mountains surrounding Bogota since the Civil War.
In a working-class area on the outskirts of Bogota, students in a party study group talk about the stark reality of growing up in these neighborhoods. They do not want to appear on camera.
We all need to work as well as go to school. I get up at 5 o'clock every morning to do the housework and cooking and look after my 4 younger brothers and sisters.
Youth gangs, drugs, and police brutality are part of our daily lives.
Police gangs on motorcycles terrorize our neighborhoods. A few months ago, they murdered 14 youth. They were street kids, homeless, drug addicts. We were the only group who came out in their defense, but the leaflet we put out was well received in the community.
We say that murdering drug addicts doesn't change the problem for us because it doesn't attack the people who distribute the drugs.
We read in Challenge that the youth in the U.S. have the same problems we do: police brutality, drugs, gangs, and no jobs.
That's because the same people are responsible. The same international bourgeoisie.
In another neighborhood, 2 longtime communists, now members of PL, discussed Challenge.
Before we read Challenge, we didn't know anything about the struggles of workers in other parts of the world.
We didn't know there were communists in the United States.
Challenge brings us together in one party to fight for the same thing: communism.
Recently, in the strike at the Muñal factory, Challenge helped the workers to organize.
Well, I think it's a very positive newspaper. It helps educate workers around the world about the importance of fighting the capitalist class.
There are many workers who are in complete solidarity with Challenge.
Challenge helps these factory workers realize that workers from all countries must unite. But many of us in Latin America are very nationalistic. That is one of the biggest obstacles that we face in building the party here.
In Ecuador, nationalism is also our biggest problem. But here it has another face. After centuries of repression, the indigenous peoples are letting themselves be led by the nationalism and reformism of their traditional leaders.
Nina Picari, a well-known lawyer involved in the indigenous movement, explains what they are fighting for.
It has to do with the return of lands, requests for loans, access to credit, technical assistance and training.
Indigenous groups organize around the issue of land. Sometimes they win, but in the end they lose. Like this dusty, unproductive land that these people were given by the courts after years of struggle and protest. Indigenous workers are separated from other workers by their leaders who stress their culture and differences, not their similarity of class and oppression.
Y así le evitan pensar en las similitudes de la opresión de clase.
We don't achieve anything by saying we're anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, or anti-anything else.
Cuando no necesitamos de eslogans, sino que las luchas concretas en el país y en el continente.
We don't need slogans, but concrete struggles, like, for example, the issue of multinationality in this country.
More and more of the indigenous, who make up almost 50% of the population, are leaving the countryside and unemployment to find jobs in the cities. Here they're building luxurious apartments high above the city of Quito for the wealthy of North and South America. An apartment costs $500,000, but a construction worker makes only $14 a week, with no benefits. As elsewhere in Latin America, child labor is common and children work the same long hours as adults. Bosses pay little attention to the health and safety of their workers.
The work here is dangerous. And we don't have any insurance.
Luis is a bricklayer. He carries 100-pound bags of cement to the floors he's working on. The floors have no safety barriers in case of falls. Accidents are common, but if these workers want insurance, they have to pay for it themselves. They weigh the choice between feeding their family and personal injury and go for food. Given choices like these, Ecuadorian workers are fighting back. Thousands of indigenous people took to the streets in 1990, protesting their appalling living conditions.
We have a great opportunity here to build the party. People are searching for something.
In Ecuador, a small group of party members are reaching out to workers and students throughout the country, turning them away from the losing reform struggle to the winning fight for communist revolution. In El Salvador, in spite of increasingly dangerous conditions, the party is growing rapidly.
There is repression by the government and the FMLN. People who criticize the FMLN have been assassinated.
But people are dissatisfied and don't trust either the FMLN or the government. When we present the ideas of the party, they are enthusiastic.
Since the international conference in May 1993, we have grown stronger ideologically. We have attracted new members in unions, among teachers, and some of the disillusioned youth in the FMLN base.
In a meeting in San Salvador, members and friends talk about the party's ideas.
I am happy to know that communist ideas are not dead.
I am a member of the International Proletariat, and I want to fight for the proletariat. That's why I joined the party.
I work for the government. There are a lot of cutbacks and layoffs in my job. Because of challenge, I understand what is going on. This is all part of the privatization of state-owned companies that's hurting workers all over Latin America.
These workers are the victims of what bourgeois economists are calling the big move to free markets. Throughout the region, local capitalists are looting public treasuries, selling off everything they can get their hands on, from banks to telephone companies. U.S. investors are in a hurry, as are their Latin American counterparts. But something is worrying the experts. Worldwide, the economy is in a crisis of overproduction. In their relentless drive for profits, capitalists have produced more goods than they can sell.
Ahorita, los capitalistas norteamericanos, que eran antes los
Meanwhile, the U.S. capitalists, once the economic giants of the world, are losing the battle for markets to Germany and Japan. Their solution is to move into Latin America for cheap labor and to sell us things we don't need.
Assembly plants are opening up. Goods and services are flooding in. With trade agreements like NAFTA, which they recently signed with Mexico, U.S. capitalists are setting up a free trade zone from Argentina to Canada and hoping to shut their imperialist rivals out.
Y nadie se está oponiendo a ellos. En el pasado,
And no one is opposing them.
aquí tenía que hacer alianza protegiendo.
In the past, the U.S. always had to protect its investments here by supporting fascist dictators.
Hoy hasta los guerrilleros nacionalistas más radicales y todo.
But today, even the nationalist guerrillas are eager to make deals. In the words of Joaquin Villalobos, top FMLN commander, what we need is a little more capitalism.
But look where more capitalism has got us. In Mexico, where many U.S. companies had already moved their operations, even before NAFTA, wages like these in this automobile plant have dropped from $7 to $4 a day in the last 10 years.
In the U.S., the standard of living has been permanently lowered. More and more workers will lose their jobs as the capitalists move their factories out, and more will certainly lose their lives in wars provoked by the bosses in the fight for markets.
More capitalism will only bring more misery for Latin America.
At the same time the economy is growing, poverty increases. Today, half of the 400 million Latin Americans, many of them children, don't have the basic necessities for survival. Workers everywhere are protesting, but like the Mexican automobile workers who went on strike for better wages, their demands are being met with vicious counterattacks by the bosses, who in their desperation to maintain their profits are resorting to fascism to control the working class. Workers and bosses are on a collision course, and as the pressure on workers increases, the rapid growth of the party in the 3 countries we visited shows us that the reality of a system which is offering only war and fascism is fertile ground for the ideas in Road to Revolution 4. In 1993, workers and students from 25 countries came together at the party's international conference in New York City. Now we are active in workers' struggles from India to Colombia. We are fighting for communism, a society geared to the common good and individual needs where workers have collective control of their lives.
We are the strongest. We are the majority. We are the proletariat. We are the ones organized in the Progressive Labor Party who have to move forward. We are the ones ready to fight.
Viva la clase proletaria, viva el partido.